Hello, Podwalkers, and thanks for listening to another episode of Goblin Lore. In this episode, we talk about artificial planes in Magic the Gathering and what we can learn from them and the planeswalkers who shaped them about shaping our own lives and our own realities. This episode is coming out a week later than we anticipated because of the run-up to Grand Prix Minneapolis, which the entire cast of Goblin Lore attended, and therefore we had to do a little bit of preparing in order to be good hosts here in Minneapolis. So from this point forward, we'll be back on our regularly scheduled programming every week, Friday at around noon. Without any further ado, let's get to the show. Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. And today's episode, we are talking about how to make your own plane with just a few household items. We're going to be digging into artificial planes, what their purpose is in the multiverse, where they came from, and what the ability to make a plane out of thin air, or, duct tape, means for our lives in the real world. But before we get there, I am going to turn it over to my co-hosts to introduce themselves and tell us all what is the building material you would use to create your own plane.
Well, I'm Alex. Be found at Alexander Newm on Twitter. And right now I'm thinking the material I would probably use is some good memory foam. It might just be because the last week or two have been kind of rough at work, and I'm kind of tired right now. But I think that's where I'm at currently.
I like that memory foam.
Just anywhere you want, you just stop and take a nap.
Yeah. Well, I am Hobbes Q, and you can find me at Hobbes Q on Twitter. For me, I kind of was thinking about this because before we got on air, I was mentioning to the guys, neither of whom have read, well, Alex has read, but it's been a while, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And all I could really think of was Slarty Bartfast, one of my favorite characters of all time, basically telling, like, he creates planets for, like, the uber rich. Like, they're the ones who create Earth to be this giant computer, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that he's really proud of is the fact that he built the fjords in Norway, and now I really just want a planet with fjords. Like, it's a fun word. Fjords look really cool. I don't see how this could go bad.
You guys could combine the two, and then you just have one giant, water theme park lazy river.
So, like Wisconsin?
Yeah, it would basically be the Wisconsin Dells.
We just alienated a whole bunch of our podcast listeners that don't know anything about the Midwest.
And I'm your host, Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's Fynd Horn. And I'm going to just go obvious here. I would make my plane out of duct tape. I used to be one of those grunge kids, one of the, almost emo kids. Like we were like proto emo back in the day, and so of course we had the furry wristband, not like furries, but like the fluffy wristbands that had like Metallica stitched on them, and we would make wallets out of duct tape. We would make like backpack. I had a friend of mine made a backpack out of duct tape. You could do anything with duct tape, so that's what I'd go with.
My friend and I used to do the whole we never actually LARPed in the sense of like doing role playing. We just made the swords and sword fought. And some people at a Kmart, I think, literally thought that we were trying to make bombs at one point because we were buying just PVC pipe and insulation foam.
Well, what else would you be doing? You wouldn't be LARPing like some sort of, nerd.
Right. I mean, to be fair, in my area, LARPing was probably the last thing that anybody would have thought. So we played like maybe once or twice, but we wore outfits. I basically was a cosplayer, is what I can determine now.
Proto cosplayer too.
Proto cosplayer also.
You were much cooler. You got in on a much cooler trend before it happened than I did. Christine Sprankle better than My Chemical Romance, in my opinion.
Least controversial thing said on this cast so far.
Let's pivot to our main topic of the night. We're talking about artificial planes, and we've had a long history of planes being made in Magic the Gathering, but we need to first sort of talk about how those come to be. How does a plane happen outside of just a natural plane that shows up. And the first thing is, the definition here is provided by MTG Wiki, so go check that out. If it's got a lot of great Vorthos content on there, really good stuff for the most part, and you can edit it if it's wrong, which is even better. But artificial planes are planes created by planeswalkers. Makes sense. Any artificial plane will eventually collapse, and all matter in the plane will be converted to energy. Also makes sense if you know about sort of the entropy and chaos energy of our own universe. Makes sense that the energy of a plane that's sort of like pushed together forcefully rather than naturally would dissipate.
This also kind of shows us too that this is our first kind of real world science analog that we kind of have in the things that we've been discussing, I would say, in this idea that it does appear that for at least some purposes of what we've been talking about, the laws of thermodynamics do apply to the Magic the Gathering multiverse.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. Like, we don't see... Magic is much more of a fantasy property than it is sci-fi, but in this regard, it for sure does go with some of those science rules. Then the definition goes on here. An artificial plane usually contains only one planet or solar system, unlike some other planes. But some planes, such as Serra's realm, don't contain planets at all. Artificial planes are usually inhabited only by creatures created by the planeswalker, or by creatures borrowed, and borrowed's in air quotes, from other planes, which we will also talk about. So, artificial planes get made. They aren't found usually, they are just created. And this was something that used to happen all the time back in the day, before a certain event that we like to call the mending.
In a real broad overview, like the pre-mending walkers were really powerful. They were godlike power, and that's how they could make planes. These planes that they have that we're going to talk about, and presumably many more that just the story never featured, because there was a lot of planeswalkers. Some of whom decided to make planes, and some of whom decided they didn't need to have their own spaces like that, or did other things. But then after the mending, there was a large series of apocalypse that all occurred and threatened to crack the multiverse. And so once that stuff was all resolved, it seemed... And I think the Future Sight, the Time Spiral Block books talk about this a little bit, and I think some of it's kind of just story hand-wavy in the background. But like the universe kind of balanced out a little bit and said, okay, these people aren't going to be this powerful anymore. And that's where we get the Neo-Walkers now. All the new Planeswalkers are just like normal people who can go to other planes. And now being able to go to other planes gives them access to other things, especially as mages. That can give them some extra power, some more diverse spells and things. So they will generally be more powerful than a random person on a normal planet. But they aren't, by their very nature, like the old Planeswalkers, when they sparked, now they have godlike power. It's a little bit more, you got to work for your power.
And that actually brings us right into our first plane profile. So I'm going to turn the keys over on the planar portal device to you, Alex, to talk about Phyrexia.
All right. Well, in Phyrexia, and we need to differentiate now because we have new Phyrexia, which, in a manner of speaking, you'll be talking about a little bit later. The original Phyrexia that Yawgmoth used was an artificial plane created by an unnamed planeswalker. We don't actually know who made it. According to what MTG Wiki has here, he was a humanoid that preferred the form of a dragon. His plane was found by Diafed, who was a planeswalker who was from the Thrawn Empire and decided to go back to the Empire after planeswalking around for a while, and ended up finding... She could tell there was a planeswalker somewhere in her old empire, this old kingdom that she used to live in, and so she decided to go looking for him, and that leads into a whole story in the Thrawn, which was really interesting. I really enjoyed that book. But she found Phyrexia, and when she was working with Yawgmoth, he was looking for a place, kind of a refuge, to bring these people who were sick that he claimed he was helping, when in reality he was just experimenting on them. So she introduced him to Phyrexia, and she created a portal that allowed him to bring all of these people to this plane that was not all that different from Mirrodin, actually. After its creation, the planet was an artificial world. There wasn't really living things. It was metal and like oil and all of this machinery and things that kind of didn't really know what it was for, because it was just left there. Ultimately, Yawgmoth, because he liked to experiment with people and learn how things worked, turned it into a lot of the Phyrexians that we later saw, the fusion between machine and living creatures. And then eventually the launched the war on Dominaria, and that led into the invasion cycle where the original Phyrexia was actually destroyed by Urza.
And it's interesting to me, too, just as a little footnote on that, a great description. It's interesting to me, too, that one of Phyrexia's other, like, sort of dominating features is that it's got 9 spheres, and it's basically, like, it's like a Russian nesting doll full of horrible things the closer and closer you get to the middle, and the middle is just Yawgmoth controlling the very fabric of reality. But, like, you know, it is essentially just Dante's Inferno put into magic. It's great. It's just hell. It's magic hell.
Oh, yeah.
So with Phyrexia, the home of the big bad, knocked out here, let's sort of pivot to the little sister, basically, of Phyrexia, Yawgmoth's pet project, almost his, like, summer plane, Rath.
Yeah. So Rath I think is really interesting. I think this is like a fascinating idea for a thing. So this was an artificial plane created by Yawgmoth. It was created out of a material called flowstone, which was really kind of flexible in what it could turn into. I see it described as semi-sentient, which I don't entirely know what that means, but it's interesting. And it was created kind of in the shadow of Dominaria, because the final invasion that happened during the invasion block, Phase 1 was planar portals, Phyrexian troops come in. But Phase 2 was the plane of Rath, because it was artificial and made out of this flowstone material, was actually overlaid onto Dominaria, so that entire legions of Phyrexian troops were just placed in the middle of key locations. There isn't a lot of details about how Yawgmoth actually made this. Talks about how he created this forge to make the flowstone and was able to kind of put this here. And we know Yawgmoth was powerful despite the fact that he wasn't a planeswalker. So, and then it also led to some interesting things. The overlay of Rath onto Dominaria led to some interesting things that we see even in the most recent Dominaria set through. Like the Skyshroud Forest was a feature on Rath that laid over where where Keld is, these red barbarians. So suddenly you have the green elves, the red barbarians, their homeland is in the same place. And because of the invasion, there's all these zombies and Phyrexians going on. They're like, all right, let's team up and fight. And then afterwards, that's where you get Radha. Her line goes back, her family goes back to those original human barbarians and Skyshroud elves who came together to form, something new out of this big disaster.
So another old artificial plane that we see a little bit in the stories, it plays a key role in the stories, but we're not there long, is Serra's realm. And Serra was a planeswalker, a white-aligned planeswalker. Notoriously, she is worshipped by angels, and in Dominaria's set and story, we see that there's the Church of Serra, which is a thing that's passed down from generations and generations ago of this sort of cult of personality around Serra the Planeswalker. And she built this world, Serra's realm, basically to be almost the exact opposite of Phyrexia, where Phyrexia is completely black aligned, all black mana, oil, 9 spheres of hell. Serra's realm is an artificial plane that has basically no structure to it, no situated flat land to rest on. There are all these floating platforms, these sky castles, these clouds, and it's just this expansive heaven place, basically. Serra created all these angels to populate it. There are humans there. We're not exactly sure if Serra brought them from somewhere else or if she created the humans as well. This features mostly in the Urza Saga stories. Basically, Urza comes there to ask Serra for help with, dealing with Phyrexia and finding Phyrexia and all of that. And she kind of goes, nah, I'm just going to hang out here because it would suck to get involved. Basically, same logic as Teferi. It would suck to get involved. This place is great. I'm going to keep this in perfect balance. What happens, though, is the Phyrexians attack and invade into Serra's realm, bringing this black mana, corrupting the realm. And with what we see, another part of artificial planes is that when they are unbalanced from their structure, it's really hard to get them back into balance. And so that instant presence of black mana throws everything off. And Urza realizes this is his one thing that is good about him in this story. He realizes that the plane is going to corrupt and collapse and die anyways. And so what he does is he collapses the entire realm into the power stone that then he puts in the engine of the skyship Weatherlight. And that's how we sort of get into modern day Weatherlight and Serra's realm, where it is in the Dominaria story.
Which is also why when you see early in the Dominaria story, they talk about this a little bit, but I love, as a very quick aside, I hope, in the most recent stories, how they will have these little pieces that if you know the deep story, it pays off, but if you don't, it's okay because they don't dwell on it. They kind of just keep telling the story. But early on, like Tiana shows up to help with the Weatherlight and this core, and like they're talking about it as a holy item for the church. Like she was there to retrieve it for the church because it is not just a sacred item that is important, it is literally Serra's realm.
And that then moves us into, I'm sort of going chronologically through these. This moves us now into our next artificial plane, which is Mirrodin, or New Phyrexia. New Phyrexia now is the former Mirrodin, which was before that Argentum, a plane made entirely out of silver. And go figure, this is a plane that was created by Karn, who is a silver golem. And Argentum, if you don't know, is a Latin word. It comes from the Latin meaning silver. Clever magic. But Karn created this mathematically perfect world made of silver, eventually it was renamed after the Mirari by Memnarch, who was the Mirari. He created these sort of golem watch beings to just sort of take care of Mirrodin. There were a couple of moons of Mirrodin that each had different ties to different mana colors. There was no green sun until we get to the Fifth Dawn story when it emerges. So the interesting thing about Mirrodin is it was completely artificial. It was every flower, every blade of grass, every tree was made of metal. I mean, oceans were quicksilver. They have razorgrass fields, and eventually when creatures came to populate the plane, there were they became a mix of organic and metal. They were brought there by Memnarch with these devices, these planar portal devices, essentially called soul traps, that essentially bound them to the plane. We see later in the story that once those get all reset, the elders of Mirrodin, flash back to their home planes, and then everything is left in chaos and all this sort of stuff. And Karn himself brought glistening oil from the Phyrexian invasion, corrupt the plane, and the plane now has, over time become New Phyrexia, sort of fractured into 5 different color-aligned factions.
Which is really, and there's some really cool things I think they did with to differentiate these Phyrexians from the original ones. The original Phyrexians, as they were essentially made in Yawgmoth's image, or at least his ideas of what he wanted to do, they were like black, just black, because that's kind of where he was. But these Phyrexians are like natural-ish, like sort of like they developed in this symbiosis with a natural world, with a natural and artificial world, and so they sort of grew organically into the 5 colors because Mirrodin as a world had all 5 colors of mana present, and lots of it in the heart of Mirrodin. And so I think it's interesting how you kind of had these divisions within Phyrexia now, because they sort of had a more natural growth as opposed to having a single person who was engineering the whole thing. Also, as another quick, funny, like, Wizards, I see what you did there. The Phyrexian symbol, that circle with a slash through it, that is the Greek letter phi.
Like Phyrexia.
Yeah.
Very good. I like it. And that'll take us to our final artificial plane, Bolas's meditation realm, and who better to talk about that than our own resident Bolas scholar, Hobbes.
Well, and Bolas's meditation realm is kind of interesting in some ways, because it was just this mysterious realm that could only be kind of accessed by Dominarian, that were really skilled servants. Specifically, Tetsu Umezawa had kind of practiced for years to try to figure out how to get there. He wanted to physically be able to travel to this realm. And so he kind of sets this realm up, and Bolas tracked it. He tracked the energy so that he could find a way to kind of get there to, he projected his mind to the realm and left his body unprotected, which I think led to some pretty bad stuff. I don't really remember that much of that part of the storyline. So if either of you do, please jump in, because I don't remember, but I remember, isn't this around the time that we kind of Bolas basically left himself completely unprotected when he was still pre-sparking?
Yep, that's exactly it. Well, it wasn't pre-sparking, but it was a moment where he leaves his body unguarded because he trusted Tetsuo to be his champion so much that Tetsuo decided to overthrow him, and cut his spirit in half, escaped the realm, and then crushed his body in the real tangible world as well.
Right. And then at this point now, so that's, yes. And so now post-mending, what we've seen this realm be is kind of, it's like Bolas's hideout. It's basically where everybody that he's kind of recruited has come to at some point. So we know that Sarkhan visited it, kind of following his assignment from Bolas at the Eye of Ugin. And he was kind of debriefed there. This is where the pools of becoming are, which we've seen the gems of becoming in one of the cards already. It's kind of the gem that is between Bolas's horns. And when he arrives, he basically finds Bolas reconstructing the body of Tezzeret. And we also have Vraska having been visited here, where she kind of got this promise of the leadership of the Golgari if she just did this minor little thing where she traveled to Ixalan and kind of located the Immortal Sun. And this is all we really have seen of this realm to date. So we don't really know as much about this one. I mean, I don't even really kind of see, it's like who created it. It's a lot more kind of nebulous in terms of it being an artificial plane. And I was wondering if either of you knew more about it from that perspective, because anything that I studied on this was just kind of we don't really know how to get there, more so than this was created.
So yeah, it's a little less of I think it's still, in my mind at least, I think of it as an artificial plane, a created plane, but it's a lot less, blood and guts and grime and grit than it is like a spiritual realm. It's a place where you go metaphysically more than you do physically.
And at this point, we kind of see that this one is at least listed as quote-unquote being stable right now. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is a realm or a plane, and especially if it is artificial, that we are going to get to find a little bit more about.
Well, and we're kind of at a point where we're currently with the core 19 story, we're looking at Bolas' backstory, which may or may not cover this, but he is a very present part of our current storyline, at least that we saw in Ixalan, and see him show up at the very, very tail end of Dominaria. Well, I mean, the whole point of the Dominarian story, too, was trying to get allies to fight him. So I suspect, I think that you're going to be right, Hobbes, that in Ravnica, not only will he show up, but that as some part of his story, we're going to find out some more about this place.
Yep, and so we kind of have a broad range of what these artificial planes are, how you get to them, what they are, who exists there. And so this kind of ties us into our real world discussion today, which is shaping the reality that you want. And so maybe you can lead us into this discussion here, Hobbes, as our resident psychologist as well. What are we talking about when we say defining our own reality or shaping reality in our own minds?
Everything we've talked about this a little bit before, but perspectives, and everything comes down to each of us can have our own perspectives and our own perception of what is happening. Two of us seeing the same situation are actually experiencing very different things because we're bringing everything of who we are to that situation. We're bringing our past experiences. We're bringing our thoughts that we're having. We're bringing our emotional state with us kind of to whatever scenario or situation that we end up in. And we're kind of seeing in the storyline, we have these powerful beings that are trying to create their almost nirvana, their utopia, but they're trying to create a world that conforms to their worldview of what they want to see. So in some ways, if at least Bolas being in this realm, what we know about it is a place of meditation. There's not people there. This is not a place that people just are allowed to be to, versus Serra's was like a giant party. It was meant to be a version of heaven with other angels and like-minded people kind of around in it. And we see that each of the planeswalkers or each of the people that we know of in these realms are trying to create situations that are conducive to how they see themselves. It's very ego-syntonic is what we would call it, in the sense that it matches their worldview, their alignment. Serra did not have a balance to this where she was having good and evil. She had what she thought was perfection in there. And I'm wondering kind of what you guys think about this, like from your own experiences with what you've seen in the world, and what type of world would you actually create if you could?
It's interesting to just to dovetail onto what you said before I answer that question. I sort of posited Serra's realm versus Phyrexia, original Phyrexia, where they're the classic heaven and hell tropes. But also, that was what Yawgmoth thought was perfection. He saw humans as frail beings that needed to be artificially perfected. Again, we talk about perspectives. When we look at it from what we'd consider what we'd consider like sort of the socially moral perspective, that's not good. What he did, not good at all. But from his perspective of, perfecting humanity and making existence exactly what he wanted it to be, that to him was perfection too. And that's fascinating to me, that you can have those two very different viewpoints and you see it that tangibly reflected in the construction and composition of those worlds.
There was a really chilling scene, I believe, in Invasion, the first book for the Invasion block, where Yawgmoth's general for the first wave of the invasion, Sabo Tabak, was vivisecting some people, and she was comparing, like talking to the Metatron, which were a artificial race that Urza created to try to protect Dominaria, and she had a Metatron vivisected next to a human, and comparing and saying, look how frail this human is, and look at all these weak points, and snap one vertebrae, and now they're paralyzed, and compared to the Metatron, and look at this wonderful craftsmanship, and trying to, I can't remember who she was even talking to, but definitely drawing some parallels between Urza and Yawgmoth, and it was, it's really chilling.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, it's interesting to think about this in real world terms, is how we shape our environments around us. I even think just about like what you do to decorate your own home. Like, just to bring this even to a lighter note, but like what is your home around you look like? And for me, I used to not care so much about the aesthetics of my home, about my apartment that I used to live in. It was this cramped little studio apartment in downtown Minneapolis, and it always had piles of clothes everywhere. I had, piles of Magic cards on shelves. I had dishes in the sink. I had, but also a little bit, unintentionally, that was a reflection of my mind at the time, where I was going through just a ton of depression and anxiety, where I sort of didn't have a direction. I hadn't figured out that I wanted to go back to school for teaching yet. I just was sort of all over the place myself. And so, a little bit, I think we do affect, even unconsciously, we affect the world around us to look like our minds. And it's a little bit funny to think about, like, if you're listening to this in a cubicle, like, look around and see, what have you hung up on the walls? What is it that you value or that like reflects your mind? I think that's an interesting practice to think about in our own lives.
Should I be worried that I just looked to my left at a giant Bolas poster?
Well, I mean, no, because Bolas is the hero. Isn't that what you've been telling us?
I'm just going by the perception that other people may have.
Oh, yeah.
But see, again, perspectives.
Yeah. You're, and to Joe, to dovetail on what you've been saying too, it's a little bit referential back and forth. I found, and I wish I could remember where I read this. There was someone was talking about like just clutter costs you like brain space sometimes, and like that can contribute to some feelings of not necessarily anxiety, but that to just some unease. And I have found that literally, if I'm starting to feel in a funk a little bit, just like, all right, I'm going to clean off my computer desk. I'm going to get rid of these cans. I'm going to organize the stuff that I have piled that I want to keep but don't have a place for it. Maybe I'll just stick it in the box in the corner. And like just doing that sometimes helps bring me into a better mental place.
Well, I mean, you almost are bringing up the concept in some ways of mindfulness. So do you guys know anything about mindfulness, just to start off with, I guess?
Yeah, it's a lot of it is just the act of consciously living. I mean, that's I guess the easiest way to boil it down. It's thinking about your breathing. It's thinking about the way that you're holding your spine when you sit. It's, thinking about how you're chewing your food, and some of those are just examples of ways that you can be mindful, but it's that act of consciously doing actions rather than just reacting, rather than just doing.
Yeah, so you bring up the example of, say, brushing your teeth or eating, which is just something that we almost do automatically. And when you do that, you actually are not aware of all the sensations and everything that's going on in your body. And you can use sometimes these tools to be mindful. Is like you said, it's a purposeful action. It actually is supposed to be a very non-judgmental action too. So when you're eating something mindfully, you are paying attention to how the sensation is of it, like a piece of chocolate. What does it feel like on your tongue? It's not about just doing it quickly. It's not about just swallowing. It's all the actions that go into. But it's also about it's a non-judgmental approach. And you see this a lot when it comes to things like deep breathing. So like the act of breathing, the purpose of it when you're doing it from a mindful perspective, you're not supposed to count your breath. You're really not supposed to change or alter it. It's just about noticing, and it's about kind of being. And in some ways, Alex, what you're describing, changing your environment, it can be an act of mindfulness to just be aware of what your environment is looking like around you at that time. To make a conscious decision that I'm going to wash the dishes, I'm going to clean up. And the idea being that, from a cognitive perspective, we always talk about everything that's happening is happening. We can make changes in our thinking, our emotions, our behavior. we can also make changes in our environment. And we're kind of seeing with these artificial planes, people are trying to take that piece of what I would call the cognitive theory when we're trying to change our mood, or we're trying to change it, and we're doing it by just changing the environment around us.
That's a great thought. It's almost to, I spaced on if you said this in what you just said, Hobbes, but it's almost like the idea of manifesting something. I don't necessarily believe in the actual practice of manifesting, where you think about something and then it happens. You know, like I want to make more money, and then it happens. You manifest money. But I think you can do that. It's kind of that step out from mindfulness. You can think about, how can I be more productive in my work, and then maybe I'll get a promotion? Or how can I get through more articles to write, and therefore I will earn more money? Or how can I structure my day more efficiently and therefore have a better work-life balance, and all that sort of stuff? That sort of manifesting, you know, just putting your mind on it. It's the old phrase of put your mind to it. And, you know, or for us baseball fans, Yogi Bear's the game is 99% mental and the other half physical. So
I recently just got back actually from a conference, and it was a conference on vocation. It was a conference on career development. It had an emphasis on everything from, you know, older people trying to return to work to students, high school. It was all the different kind of areas, right? Anything that could be a career development is what this conference was about. The best talk that I saw during this conference was on how do we apply chaos theory to making goals and to setting goals when it comes to something like vocation. Because the problem is, we treat most things in life as if they are linear. You know, we treat them as if they're a linear thing that is going to happen, okay? And what we know is that most things aren't linear. In fact, most things are definitely not linear. And so how do we take advantage of that? And chaos theory kind of tells us that part of what we should do is simply, we should take advantage of those situations. So like you said, Joe, if I think that I want to have money, I'm not going to just have money the next day. But I can try to take advantage of situations where I might get lucky. So maybe I do attend a meeting where I know that I might have a chance encounter with somebody to network. So, you know, the idea being that a lot of what happens in business does happen from chance encounters. You hear a lot about networking. Networking is a huge deal. So, well, even though you can't predict which conversation may lead to the outcome that you want, you can put yourself in the situation to just have lots of conversations. To try to, at the top of this, before we ever started, Alex and I were kind of talking a little bit about statistical probability, and this idea that like people don't really understand stats, and that's why people struggle with this concept of luck, actually, or even just. And I would say this applies in a lot to Magic, when this, you know, the shuffler screwed me, you know, this very unlikely thing happened. Well, statistics are simply not going to say that unlikely things don't happen. They're just unlikely to happen, so they don't happen as frequently. But if you have enough events, it's going to happen at some point. And I think that is kind of what this chaos theory is playing off of, is you just put yourself in the situation where you can try to have that event happen while you're there. And that is what these artificial planes in some ways are. They're trying to create situations that will best mimic what they want to have happen.
I think, too, you know, sort of pulling this even more into what the mind space of these creators was when we get there, you know, or what the mind space of these creators was when they made the planes. You know, Karn, for instance, I think about this a lot. Karn created Mirrodin to be this perfect plane, not perfect in the terms of Serra's realm, because he's been there. I mean, he'd seen what had happened. He tended the engines of the Weatherlight. He knows Serra's realm and that story. Not perfect in the terms of Phyrexia, because he also knows about Phyrexia, but perfect just as in balanced. He actually was trying to eliminate mathematical chance and just balance everything. He wanted it to be completely like cause and effect structured. And, I think part of that is he had this lifetime of seeing humanity and organic and natural things just, corrupt for one way or another. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was lust. Maybe it was power. Maybe it was just simple chaos. But he tries to build this artificial world where none of that will happen, and yet it still happens, and that's fascinatingly tragic to me.
He's trying to create what is it, like a sound box? It's kind of how I think of it. That's just a little device that has this mathematical thing that goes through its whole programming, and that's what it is. And unfortunately, something that large and intricate, it doesn't take a whole lot to just shift it, a little bit to one side, and all of a sudden everything's thrown off.
It's the gathering momentum. At some point, it's unstoppable.
Right, and that's that whole element of chaos theory. The chances start getting larger and larger and larger as you follow one of those statistical probabilities. I think, too, I think a lot about the influence that being being the creation of Urza, being his servant in a way, his test subject, basically, and then now essentially being part Urza, he's his planeswalker heir in a way. I think a lot of what Karn does is trying to right the wrongs of weirdly the person that I would call his father. It's sort of the sins of the father visited on the son here. And I think that is a lot of why he created Mirrodin the way he did. Urza so staunchly defended Dominaria, but Dominaria was flawed. It was always going to be flawed.
And I wonder, too, if some of it was he was part of that, like the invasion is just like a horrific event. And to go back to maybe trauma a little bit. And the invasion was just a capstone on this whole thing. Like, Karn and Urza had been battling the Phyrexians in various different ways for a very long time. And I wonder if once the invasion was done, he's like, okay, the threat is over, Yawgmoth is dead, Phyrexia is neutralized. I need quiet. I need peace. I need catharsis. I'm going to go build this plane of just perfection with no living thing, no unpredictability, and it's going to just run through its paces, this world of perfect mathematics.
Right. It's almost this kid who has a really tough time at school, doesn't have friends or just is having a tough time in classes or something, but he goes home and he logs on to Minecraft.
It's kind of an escapism. I mean, like, that's what a lot of hobbies are. I mean, and like, especially hobbies of fantasy can do that, but a lot of things, it gives you a place to go that is different than the place you are at and different than the place you have been. And that, I think, fits for a lot of these worlds.
Well, I think, unless you guys have anything else to put in on this, or any last notes, I think that's a really good place to stop. Maybe we just, end it with this sort of, not plea, but this request to all of you listening and to each of us individually, this sort of, charge to be mindful about creating the world around you that you want. It's the whole golden rule: treat others the way you want to be treated. It's not just your physical space, it's your personality, it's your interactions with people. But, if you give out kindness, love, warmth, care, people will see that, and more often than not, they will reflect it. That whole effect on the world around you. If you want that, create your plane, create your reality around you, do things to affect it. You have that power.
I will even say, just as an experiment that you can try this week, and trust me, it's something that's really, really simple. I used to work with a pharmacy student that was joining in on some of our groups in psychology and was learning kind of about a lot of the theories and how things kind of worked. And he had said that, people are generally in their day-to-day life are they're going to and from places. And we work in a medical center that is very large. And he would notice that even here in the Midwest, people had their head down and were just on their way. So he just started smiling at people when he passed them in the hallway. And I don't really want to talk about what happened. I mean, I'm sure people are kind of thinking, but I really would encourage you to try this. in your own life is to go out there and to see what happens if you do something as simple as smile at somebody.
Let's do one quick whip around here, bring it back to sort of a lighthearted, a goofy note. What is one thing, if you were on your own artificial plane, what's one thing that you would make sure to put on there for yourself? Let's start with you, Alex.
So I think there's a lot of good answers for this, but I'm pretty sure there's only one right answer. And that answer is to make sure that I have some doggos on my plane. Because good. I gotta have some puppers to go with the memory foam.
Good choice. Hobbes.
What we let Alex go first? Jeez. I mean, because I think we all know that I was probably going to just start off here with doggos too. So, you know...
You can totally... Like I said, there's only one right answer. You can also be right. I'm willing to share that with you, Hobbes.
Well, you know what? So I determined that instead of us doing this, instead of me choosing just the same answer, I'm going to just even go more lighthearted and say that I am going to have homunculi. Because they're kind of the doggos of Magic.
They really are.
Yeah.
That's a good choice.
They are good boys. And as for me, I can't get away from it. I do have to say the other right answer, and really the best right answer, which is cats. Cats for commanders. All day. This is a cats podcast.
It's not that I have anything against cats, but I mean, they just aren't dogs. I'm not sure if it's because they're not trying hard enough, or if there's just something else going on. I'm trying not to hold it against them.
Well, to be fair, dogs in Magic aren't dogs either. They're hounds.
Oh, and that is a whole other thing.
And that's a whole other podcast.
Oh, God.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. You can find Joe Redeman on Twitter at Findhorn. You can find Hobbes Q on Twitter at Hobbes Q. And you can find Alex on Twitter at Alexander New M. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod. And you can email us any questions, comments, or concerns at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. And remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.